Welcome to Better Cybersecurity, the ISF podcast. I'm your host, Steve Durbin.
ISF CEO Steve Durbin is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. In today's episode, Steve speaks with Sir Jeremy Fleming, former director of GCHQ, the UK intelligence agency with a broad mission covering global intelligence, cybersecurity, and cyber operations. The two discuss the evolution of the cyber landscape, as well as the broad spectrum of cyber challenges facing the world today, from the role of the government and how to protect critical infrastructure, to how businesses should approach cyber resilience, to the potentials and perils of new technologies.
Jeremy, lovely to see you. Thank you for stopping by the studio this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Now, you've got a very interesting career from our listeners' standpoint. You joined MI5 in 1993. MI5, listeners outside the UK, is the UK's domestic counterintelligence and security agency. And after working there for a while, you were appointed GCHQ's 16th director in 2017, where you oversaw the development of GCHQ into a world-leading cyber organisation during a period of what was pretty significant geopolitical turmoil at that time. And you also established the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, and with the military created the National Cyber Force to deliver cyber operations. In addition to advising UK prime ministers and various other things, you probably know quite a bit about this topic, I would imagine. No pressure at all. Tell me, Jeremy, over that sort of period, you've obviously seen a lot of evolution in the way that cyber has changed and impacted not just nation states, but also businesses. What are some of the key changes that you've seen?
You're making me feel really old there, Steve. And it is, as I reflect on it, it is over 20 years since we first started to see cyber operations, since we first started to see states take an interest in projecting their cyber power, and since we first started to see criminals spotting there was a buckethead. And in that way, in the way I describe it there, that things are still the same. Cyber is a big business. It's a global business for some. People making a lot of money from criminality from it. States are still using it as an adjunct to other forms of state power. And they're using it to steal secrets and to try and get ahead of each other. But the complexity and the pace and the breadth of impact is completely beyond recognition. And in part, that's just because of the way the world has gone.
Right.
We are now much more technically enabled. The foundations of the technology ecosystems that we use are pervasive in every area of our lives and in governments and in the way in states interrelate to each other. So if you like, the harm and the threat, the potential for harm and threat has gone up, and the attack surface has gone up. And at times we found it hard to keep pace with that development. So the short answer to your question is, it's just more pervasive, it's of greater sophistication, and the impacts are much more significant.
You touched on government there. I'm curious, because I'm often asked this question myself. What do you see the role of government being in cyber?
We're living in an age when governments don't have control of technologies or in the way in which you might have thought that they had in the past. If you look to the post-war period, post-World War II that is, and you think about where new technologies were coming from, then lots of them were coming from government-sponsored scientific programs. And I guess you could say the internet was the last thing that came out of those sorts of programs in the same way as we had become used to. And today, technologies are developed, owned, operated in the private sector, and data is overwhelmingly in the private sector, and a lot of the attack surface is in the private sector. So into that space, government steps carefully. The government doesn't have control of all of the levers, and yet obviously it's important for nation security and their prosperity that we live in a cyber secure environment. So in that context then, governments, I think, have a fundamental role to set the tone for that digital cyber hygiene. They need to work out what the incentives should be in the system to enable security to be built in to technologies from the off. They need to work out which areas of behaviour are completely beyond the pale and will require some sort of sanction. They need to encourage cross-border cooperation. But above all, I think a government's role is to work really closely with their private sectors. You can't do it on their own. So they have to go for a different type of partnership.
And how well equipped do you think they are to do that?
It depends. It depends on where you are in the world. You can point to a number of governments that have done some successful things. I like to think the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, certainly when it was set up for those first few years, was a world leader. No, I was also running it quite recently.
Right.
And these things, they don't stay still. You have to keep reinventing them. And it's done a pretty good job at that. In Europe, the picture is really patchy. Some places do it well, some places less well. In America, I think there was a big catching up on cybersecurity over the last 5 years or so. And now this current administration is showing less interest in it again. So this ebbs and flows according to the political tide. Yeah. But I think there is a role for governments in this. And I think governments need to keep trying to make sure that they are relevant in this space and at this pace of technology change.
Let's turn to critical national infrastructure, because obviously that's increasingly at the top of threat actors' agenda, whether it be overtly or somewhat more under the covers. What do you think it is that we can do to protect our critical infrastructure today and into the future?
The concept of critical national infrastructure is changing massively, isn't it? And this is because of our dependence on tech, because our understanding that resilience is different nowadays, some of the ways in which geopolitics is playing out in supply chains and trend towards more sovereign capabilities, or at least more sovereign approaches. So the very concept of critical national infrastructure is completely different to when I first started thinking and talking about it. And we have to keep that up to date. And again, come back to my answer to your previous question, I think in some places we're not doing a very good job of that. We have to understand that we are dependent on the backbone of the internet. We are dependent on the big cloud providers. We are dependent on new forms of energy and more sovereign approaches to energy. And we've got to make sure that our systems and government approaches to keep up with that. First thing, make sure we know what it is today. Beyond that then, it depends where we are in the world, but most countries have taken a view that cyber regulation, cyber compliance should fall under the bits of government that are most concerned with the running or the relationship with that industry. And to a large degree, I think that's a good approach. It means that you're thinking of cyber as part of all the other things that you need to think about. When you're looking at security of supply and physical threats and personnel threats, I think it's really helpful to have cyber alongside all of those. But it can mean that there's a bit of a disconnect between different areas of critical national infrastructure. Some places are being held to higher standards than to others. So we need to make sure that we are thinking right across government when we're thinking about the approach to critical national infrastructure and how we can make it most safe for our users and for our populations. And as we think about the future, then my personal view is that we don't spend enough time thinking about how we can design in security at the start. We can all see where critical national infrastructures are going. We know now that artificial intelligence approaches, capabilities are going to be critical national infrastructure if they're not already. And yet, we're not really learning the lessons of how we design in security from the off. So doing more to make sure that we're thinking about these at the start as we approach artificial intelligence or quantum or aspects of bioscience or future energy. These are all areas where we could do a better job.
Why is it, do you think, that people are not anti, but almost leave behind building security in at the outset? Because it's much easier to put it in at the beginning than it is to try to retrofit it.
Well, it's not where the incentives are. Designing new technology, then largely you're interested in getting it out to the biggest market as quickly as possible. If you're commercializing it, you want to make sure that you're making a profit from it or that the company is scaled as quickly as possible. You're trying to engage with users, gain market share. History has shown that there isn't much of a premium in a consumer's mind from having security designed in at the beginning. Now, interestingly, I think that might change. As we're talking about an environment where technology is so pervasive, I do wonder, and I think there are some signs that consumers are starting to value that more. If you can show that the technology that you're consuming is safe, meets a particular standard or a regulation, it might be the case that consumers are more prepared to trust those technologies in some circumstances. But beyond that, you might need to reach to a few more sticks. I mean, I really think that for some of these ubiquitous technologies, the fact that we still have vulnerabilities built into them that we've known about in some cases for decades is inexcusable.
If we look at the UK for a moment, there's a lot of talk in the UK about enabling the National Health Service, various other parts of citizen access to government with technology. And yet at the same time, there is also something of a resistance or a skepticism, if you like, on the part of the population as to government's ability to keep their information secure and for it to actually work. One of the things about technology is that it's great until it isn't, and it inherently is set to fail at some point in time. The NCSC recently, in their annual report, was talking about perhaps using old-fashioned backups, as some of us might call it, simply having the most important stuff written down as opposed to holding it in some sort of technology shell. Is that something that you think we ought to be looking at more? A sort of a move to retro, if you like, going back to the old days when you actually knew where something was, being able to put it down on a bit of paper. And should we all be anticipating technology failures?
There's a lot in all that, isn't there? And I think that, firstly, population's view to data loss has changed. So certainly if you went back 5 or certainly 10 years ago, the thought that your personal details might be out there in some sort of cyber leak was major news.
Yes.
You remember the first talk probably in the UK, but we could all name major concern about what that meant for our privacy and our security. The problem now is that this happens so often that, if you like, we've all priced it into the conversation. People aren't as sceptical. I haven't seen recent polling on whether people care that an organisation may or may not be looking after their own personal data, but they do care about continuity of operations and access, and they still do care about some things at the heart of their personal data, if you like, their crown jewels, their bank accounts, probably aspects of their health information, and a few other things, sensitive relationships within families. I'm not saying that's right, but I think that's where public discourse has moved, if you like. I think that means that populations are asking governments to make sure that they can do the things that they need to do reliably, and then to make sure that the things that are absolutely at the heart of the things that they most care about probably isn't their email address, but it is their bank account, for example, that those are secure. Feels to me as though that's changed a bit and the debate has changed a bit. To your question about writing things down, I think that was an attempt to help people to understand that you really got to focus on your recovery. And I took the writing down reference to be, you ought to have backup systems that may be paper-based that allow you to continue with your operation. And that wherever you look, in relation to the attacks we've had in the UK over the summer, you see it in Japan, actually, with their attack on Asahi, one of their national beers. Actually, they did revert to pen and paper for their supply chains in that instance. So the encouragement, I don't think, was to write everything down on paper. The encouragement was to make sure that if the worst happened, the very worst fallback that you might need to go to is some approach that avoids technology altogether. And maybe that's necessary in some environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly Marks and Spencer, some of their suppliers reverted to that, didn't they, when they had that big outage not that long ago?
I won't be the first commentator to suggest that personal data is still important and it's still part of our crown jewels, but continuity of operation is the thing that people are understanding is really in play now for big businesses.
I'll ask you about that, because you sit on a number of boards as well. How do you think that board level perception of the danger to minimum viable company operation has been received in the boardroom? Are most boards there now, do you think?
It's patchy. It's much better. I don't encounter a serious board that hasn't had a proper cyber conversation and hasn't done a cyber exercise. Trouble is, I still encounter plenty who haven't done one for 18 months, who haven't updated to the latest threat environment, who haven't thought about geopolitics coming into play, haven't checked that they've still contracted with a company who's going to help them wind back in the event that they are breached, hasn't thought seriously about whether it's going to pay a ransom, the implications of paying a ransom, bang, bang, bang. So I think there's broad understanding at board levels of serious companies. I think there's a job to do to make sure that it's refreshed sufficiently, and your members have a really important role to play in that. The irony I've always thought for your profession is that you shouldn't be front and centre on it in front of the board. You should be enabling, underpinning, helping the conversation, but it shouldn't be a specialist thing that boards just rely on your profession to manage. It's a whole of business thing. And making it a whole of business conversation, I suspect that there are a few chief execs and chairmen and women right around the world who are thinking about this rash of attacks over the last year and understanding that they've got a lot more to do.
No, absolutely. And I think that one of the most recent ones, obviously, that people be aware of is the Jaguar Land Rover. And the sums of money that we're talking about there having been lost are really quite eye-watering, £1.9 billion. If you set aside the monetary aspect of it, it's also the potential for jobs. I think that was the first time that I had seen one of the unions in the UK, Unite, actually come out and express concern for their members in terms of job losses. So for me, that marked a little bit of a shift in terms of the level of awareness that there was out there of the impact of cyber attacks on fairly large businesses with extended supply chains. So that, I think, from my perspective, it was probably a good thing to raise it to that level, because I think all too often people still seem to think of it as something that happens in the technology stack.
And it's not done yet, is it?
No.
£1.9 billion. Government has promised 1.5 billion of support on top of that.
Yeah.
So you're £3.5 billion worth of impact, a couple of 100,000 jobs in the supply chain, and only handfuls of cars coming off the production line. These are company survival events.
Yes.
And I suspect a lot of people are sitting up and taking notice of that.
You would hope. You would hope. You mentioned geopolitics. You mentioned the way in which that has evolved, if you like. Tell us a little bit more about that. What are some of the key trends that you've seen over the last few years that have changed things significantly?
We're going to talk about this later on around the conference table, but I guess I have a couple of things in mind. The first thing is that what we're seeing now around changes in geopolitics is definitely a structural change. It's not a cyclical change. So the post-1948 Bretton Woods approach to the global order, with a whole load of United Nations agencies, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, an approach to international aid, World Bank. These are all institutions that have changed fundamentally and won't change back. This is fundamentally a different operating environment now. And that means it flows to the second thing, which is that we're living in a very volatile age where it's very hard to be with any sense of predictability, to understand where things are going to move. And that means that our approach, whether you're a nation state, whether you're a group of nation states, or you're a big company or a professional organization, is all about hedging. It reduces risk, arguably, but it also reduces innovation.
Right.
It reduces cooperation. It increases risk in other ways. I am particularly worried about the impact of this on what you might call trust. Do we trust the way things have operated for decades to still be the case in the future? Do we trust that our alliances are going to operate in the same way as we've come to expect? Do we trust that deterrence is still a thing in cyber or more broadly? Do we trust the information sources that are pushed towards us, including from governments? Do we trust our electoral processes? And so these are all really big shifts in the geopolitical environment that make it more unpredictable, more hedged, more volatile, and ultimately less trusted. And I think that's really serious. You could say that none of us have ever done a good job at judging these shifts in advance, but it does feel to me to be a particularly tricky time. And at a time when there are other big global shifts going on too. China is close to a peer-level superpower with America. You've got a climate change making a real impact from a security perspective, from an economic perspective, from a people flow perspective, with all of the politics that flows with that. And I guess perhaps above all in this context, you've got a pace of tech change, which is mind-boggling. Just doing things that we didn't imagine 3 years ago, let alone 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So this feels to me like a really tricky time, an intense period of geopolitical change. And as you well know, all geopolitics is local politics in the end. So it's coming home to roost.
Yeah. What gives you hope for the future, Jeremy?
I'm a tech optimist, despite the way in which I have been talking for the last couple of minutes. I think when we have big technology revolutions, there's always a lot of friction and bumpiness. It doesn't escape me that 140 years after the rollout of electricity for the first time, there are still 800 million people in this world who don't have access at all to it. And the pace at which this latest generation of technology is diffusing is going to be difficult for us, but the upsides are incredible. They're incredible for this profession as well. I sometimes encounter quite a lot of pessimism about whether technology is enabling the attacker or the defender.
Yeah.
And I think that people are largely believing that it's favouring the attacker at the moment.
Yes.
But there's great potential here for the defender, and I think we'll start to see that come through as the incentives to do that become more to the fore. I'm definitely an optimist about where technology can take us. I'm also an optimist about the sense of human spirit and innovation. And I'm a bit longer in the tooth now, and that sense of what it is to evolve and what is meaningful, what are the things that we care about, a sense of values that sustain us, that give us all interesting long-term purpose. That is going to sustain us too.
Yeah.
I'm a million miles away from a science fiction, turn the lights off type scenario.
That's right. I think for me, what will determine the way in which things go forward will be how we as people adapt to the use of these different technologies. I'm a firm believer that us without technology, without people, you're going nowhere. It's simply how you can adapt to using that, making the most of it at a time when, as you rightly point out, everything continues to change. But that's what makes the profession so exciting and interesting. And I think that hopefully people who've been listening to this, who are thinking about a career perhaps in cybersecurity, will be encouraged at the amount of opportunity that is out there. So Jeremy Fleming, thank you very much indeed for spending time talking through some of those fairly big issues, but also giving a very practical perspective, I think. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's been great to have the conversation.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with more expert insights and thought-provoking discussions. But in the meantime, if you really enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate, review and share the podcast. If you're interested in becoming an ISF member or continuing the conversation further, please do get in touch with me at steve.durbin@securityforum.org, or indeed get hold of me on LinkedIn. And remember, you can explore all our media and resources at our website, securityforum.org.